The dust swirled like copper-colored ghosts across the auction yard as Pearl Harrington stood on the wooden platform. Her chin lifted in defiance, despite the iron shackles that bit into her wrists. Wyoming Territory, 1876, a place where fortunes were made and broken on the turn of a card, where a woman without protection was as vulnerable as a newborn calf in wolf country. $500 for the schoolteacher, shouted the auctioneer, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes that had witnessed too many human transactions to retain any semblance of compassion. Education comes at a premium, gentlemen. She can read, write, cipher, and keep your books. Pearl's green eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her fear, though it twisted in her stomach like a rattlesnake. 3 days ago, she had been the respectable schoolteacher in the growing settlement of Clearwater. Now, she was being auctioned to pay her late father's debts she hadn't known existed until Marshall Jenkins had appeared at her door with papers claiming ownership of everything, including her contract as a teacher. 550. Called a voice from the crowd, a cattle baron whose reputation for cruelty toward his ranch hands was surpassed only by rumors of how he treated the women he purchased. Pearl's heart thundered against her ribs, but her face remained impassive. 24 years of life had taught her to hide her emotions behind a mask of calm dignity. 600, drawled another voice, this one belonging to the owner of the local saloon. His intentions were clear enough. Pearl would fetch a fine price from lonely miners and cowboys if she were installed in one of his upstairs rooms. The auctioneer's gavel hovered expectantly. 600 going once, $1,000. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a tall figure strode forward. The man wore a long duster coated with the dust of the trail and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. When he tilted his head up, Pearl caught her first glimpse of piercing blue eyes set in a sun-bronzed face. "Vaughn Nordstrom," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes widened. $1,000 from Mr. Nordstrom. Do I hear 1,100? The cattle baron spat into the dirt. 1,100. 1,500, Vaughn countered without hesitation, his gaze never leaving Pearl's face. A hush fell over the crowd. $1,500 was a small fortune enough to buy a decent spread of land or a respectable herd of cattle. The auctioneer's voice trembled with excitement. $1,500, going once, going twice, 2,000, the cattle baron growled, his face mottled with rage. Pearl's fingernails dug into her palms. She was not merchandise to be haggled over, yet here she stood, her fate determined by the depths of strange men's pockets. 3,000, Vaughn said, his voice calm as still water. The crowd gasped. The cattle baron cursed and stalked away. No woman was worth that much, not even one who could read Shakespeare and calculate complex sums in her head. 3,000 going once, going twice. Sold to Vaughn Nordstrom. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Pearl was led down from the platform, her legs wooden beneath her. What kind of man paid $3,000 for a woman? What would he expect in return? As she approached, Vaughn Nordstrom removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, not from age, for he couldn't be more than 30, but from squinting against the harsh western sun. "Miss Harrington," he said with a slight nod, "Mr. Nordstrom." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "I believe I'm now your property." Something flickered across his face. Was it discomfort, regret? Before she could decide, he turned to the auctioneer's assistant. "Remove those shackles." The man hesitated. "Sir, until the papers are remove them now." There was steel in his voice, the kind that made men twice his size step back. The assistant fumbled with the keys, and Pearl felt the blessed relief as the iron fell away from her wrists, revealing angry red welts beneath. Vaughn handed the man a stack of bills, signed the necessary papers, then turned back to Pearl. "Do you have belongings to collect? They took everything." The admission stung, but it was the truth. "My father's debts. I'm aware of the situation." He nodded toward a wagon at the edge of the yard. I have a ranch 10 miles north of here. We should leave before the crowd disperses. Some men don't take kindly to being outbid." Pearl glanced around at the sullen faces of the men who had hoped to purchase her for far less than Vaughn Nordstrom had paid. "Yes, I imagine they don't." He helped her into the wagon, his touch impersonal yet somehow gentle. As they pulled away from the auction yard, Pearl allowed herself one backward glance. Her life in Clearwater was over. Whatever awaited her at Vaughn Nordstrom's ranch was her future now. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, the wagon jolting over the rutted road. Pearl's mind raced with questions, but pride kept her lips sealed. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Vaughn spoke. "You must be wondering why I paid so much for you." Pearl stiffened. "I assume you had your reasons, Mr. Nordstrom." "I did." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "And they're not what you might think. With all due respect, sir, I've learned not to make assumptions about men's thoughts." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." He paused, then added, "I need a teacher." Pearl turned to look at him fully for the first time. "A teacher? For the children at my ranch and the surrounding homesteads. There are 12 of them, ages 6 to 16, with no proper schooling." He glanced at her. "Your reputation preceded you, Miss Harrington. They say you're the finest teacher this territory has seen." Hope flickered in Pearl's chest, but she quickly suppressed it. "And that's why you paid $3,000 for a teacher?" "Partly." The wagon rounded a bend and a valley opened before them. In the distance, she could see buildings nestled against the backdrop of the mountains. "The rest we can discuss when we reach Northstar Ranch." Pearl fell silent again, turning his words over in her mind. A teacher. Not a wife, not a mistress, not a saloon girl, a teacher. Could she dare to believe him? As they drew closer to the ranch, she could make out a large main house, several outbuildings, a barn, and what appeared to be a small cabin set apart from the rest. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, and lanterns were being lit as dusk gathered. A woman emerged from the house as the wagon pulled into the yard, tall, straight-backed, with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. She wore a practical dress and a spotless apron, and her expression as she surveyed Pearl was one of careful assessment. "Mrs. Whitaker," Vaughn called as he set the brake. "This is Miss Pearl Harrington." "The teacher you mentioned." Mrs. Whitaker's tone was neither friendly nor unfriendly, merely practical. "Yes, she'll be staying in the east cabin." Pearl climbed down from the wagon without assistance, determined to show whatever strength she had left. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitaker." The older woman nodded. "Likewise, I'm sure you must be exhausted and hungry after your—" She hesitated. "Ordeal," Pearl supplied, "indeed." "Come inside. I've kept supper warm." Pearl followed Mrs. Whitaker toward the main house, acutely aware of Vaughn Nordstrom's gaze on her back. Whatever his true intentions, she would learn them soon enough. For now, the promise of a hot meal and perhaps a night's safe sleep was enough to quiet the persistent fears that had been her only companions since her father's death. The main house was surprisingly comfortable, not opulent, but solid and well-maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated the sitting room, and the furniture, while plain, showed signs of careful craftsmanship. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the polished wood floors. "The dining room is through here," Mrs. Whitaker said, leading Pearl through a doorway. A long table surrounded by sturdy chairs occupied the center of the room. 2 places were set, one at the head and one to the right. "Mr. Nordstrom usually takes his evening meal alone," Mrs. Whitaker explained, "but he thought you might have questions about your situation." She gestured to a side door. "The kitchen is through there. I'll bring out the food." Left alone, Pearl took the opportunity to examine the room more closely. A bookcase against one wall held volumes of Shakespeare, Dickens, and several agricultural journals. The windows were hung with simple but clean curtains, and a landscape painting, amateur but heartfelt, decorated the wall opposite the bookcase. This was not the home of a crude, uneducated rancher. Whatever Vaughn Nordstrom might be, he was more complex than she had initially assumed. Footsteps in the hallway announced his return. He had shed his duster and hat and washed the trail dust from his face and hands. Without the concealment of his hat, she could see his features more clearly: strong jawline, straight nose that had been broken at least once, and those startling blue eyes beneath dark brows. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair beside the head of the table. Pearl complied, her back rigid. Mrs. Whittaker entered with a tray bearing roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. The smell made Pearl's stomach clench painfully. She couldn't remember her last proper meal. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker," Vaughn said. "That will be all for tonight." The housekeeper nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. Vaughn filled Pearl's plate before serving himself. "Please eat, we can talk after." Pride warred with hunger, and hunger won. Pearl ate with as much dignity as she could muster, though she wanted nothing more than to devour the food like a starving wolf. Vaughn ate more slowly, occasionally glancing at her with what might have been concern. When she had eaten her fill, Pearl placed her fork deliberately beside her plate. "You said we would discuss the rest of your reasons for purchasing me once we reached your ranch." Vaughn pushed his own plate aside. "I did." He regarded her steadily. "What do you know about your father's debts, Miss Harrington?" The question surprised her. "Very little. I knew he had business dealings with several men in town, but he always assured me our situation was secure. After his death, Marshal Jenkins presented documents showing that my father owed considerable sums to a consortium led by Jason Blackfield, the cattle baron who bid against me today." Pearl nodded. "The debts apparently included our house, all our possessions, and somehow my teaching contract. I still don't understand how that was possible." "It wasn't." Vaughn's voice hardened. "Your father's debts were real enough, but the inclusion of your person in those debts was illegal. Unfortunately, Blackfield has Judge Harmon in his pocket, and the marshal follows orders. If it was illegal, then why did I participate in the auction?" He sighed. "Because refusing to acknowledge their authority would have resulted in violence and possibly your disappearance. Blackfield wanted you, Miss Harrington, and he's not a man accustomed to being denied." A chill ran down Pearl's spine. "And you know this how?" "Because your father and I were business partners once, years ago. He was an honest man caught in Blackfield's web, just as many others have been." Vaughn rose and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. He withdrew a document from a drawer and returned to the table. "This is your bill of sale." Pearl flinched at the term but took the paper with steady hands. "Read the final paragraph," he instructed. She scanned the legal language until she found what he meant. "The bearer of this document, Vaughn Nordstrom, hereby transfers all rights and ownership of Pearl Harrington to herself, effective immediately upon countersignature." Pearl looked up, confusion warring with a fragile hope. "I don't understand." Vaughn produced a pen and inkwell. "Sign it, Miss Harrington, and you are your own woman again. The $3,000 buys your freedom, nothing more." Pearl's hand trembled as she dipped the pen. "Why would you do this?" "Because no person should own another." His eyes held hers. "And because I owed your father a debt that money couldn't repay." She signed her name with a flourish, feeling as though she were in a dream. "There," Vaughn said as the ink dried. "Legally, you are now free to go wherever you wish. And what about your need for a teacher?" "That part was true. The children here desperately need education. I'm prepared to offer you a proper contract with salary, room and board, and complete autonomy in your classroom." He paused. "But the choice is yours. If you wish to leave the territory entirely, I'll provide funds for your journey." Pearl studied his face, searching for deception but finding none. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Nordstrom, and teaching is what I know." She straightened her shoulders. "I accept your offer, provided I see the contract before signing." For the first time, a genuine smile transformed his face. "Of course, we'll draw it up tomorrow." He stood. "For tonight, Mrs. Whittaker has prepared the east cabin for you. It's small but comfortable and completely private. Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the children and show you the building we've set aside for a schoolroom." As Pearl followed him outside into the cool evening air, stars were beginning to appear in the vast Wyoming sky. The east cabin, as he'd called it, was indeed small, just one room with a porch, but the windows glowed with welcoming lamplight. "Mrs. Whittaker has left fresh linens and some basic necessities," Vaughn said as they reached the door. If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask. Pearl turned to face him. Mr. Nordstrom, I still don't fully understand your motivations, but I am grateful. He shook his head. Don't thank me for treating you with basic human decency, Miss Harrington. That should be expected, not exceptional. He tipped his hat. Good night, rest well. As he walked away toward the main house, Pearl entered her new home. A small bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, a rocking chair by the stove, a table with a single chair, and a bookshelf with a few volumes, simple accommodations, but clean and private. On the table lay a folded nightgown, undergarments, and a plain but serviceable dress, clearly Mrs. Whittaker's work. Beside them was a note in a firm hand. Miss Harrington, welcome to Northstar Ranch. Breakfast at 6:30, V. Nordstrom. Pearl sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of relief. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she was free, safe, and remarkably still a teacher. She changed into the nightgown, washed her face and hands in the cool water from the pitcher, and slid beneath the quilt. As exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, Pearl wondered about the debt Vaughn Nordstrom felt he owed her father, and why a man who so clearly valued freedom and education had chosen the isolation of a remote Wyoming ranch. The morning dawned clear and crisp, sunlight filtering through the curtains to wake Pearl from the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. For a moment, she was disoriented. This wasn't her room in Clearwater. Then memory rushed back. The auction block, Vaughn Nordstrom's unexpected intervention, the document that had restored her freedom. She rose quickly, aware that breakfast would be served soon. The dress Mrs. Whittaker had left fit well enough, though it was a bit loose in the waist. Pearl twisted her honey-brown hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck and pinched her pale cheeks to bring some color to them. The main house was already bustling when she arrived. Mrs. Whittaker directed her to the dining room, where she found Vaughn seated at the head of the table, a ledger open beside his plate. He rose when she entered. Miss Harrington, I trust you slept well. Very well, thank you. Good, please join me. He gestured to the same chair she had occupied the previous evening. As they ate breakfast eggs, bacon, and sourdough biscuits, Vaughn outlined her duties. School will run from 8 to 3 Monday through Friday. The children will arrive by 8:30. Some live here on the ranch, others come from neighboring homesteads. He poured coffee for them both. We've converted an old storage building into a schoolroom. It needs some finishing touches, but the basics are their desks, blackboard, books. How many children did you say there were? 12 altogether, though attendance can be irregular during planting and harvest. The oldest is 16, the youngest 6. He smiled slightly. They're a handful, but eager to learn. Most have had only sporadic schooling until now. And what will you expect them to learn? Reading, writing, arithmetic. Whatever you deem important, Miss Harrington. I hired a teacher, not a recitation machine. Your classroom is your domain. Pearl found herself warming to this unusual man. Most men in the territory viewed education, especially for girls, as an unnecessary luxury. And the contract you mentioned? I've drawn up a preliminary agreement. He passed her a document from beside his ledger. Please review it and suggest any changes you feel are necessary. Pearl read carefully. The terms were more than fair, $20 per month plus room and board, with additional compensation for any supplies she needed to purchase. The contract was for 1 year, with the option to renew if both parties were satisfied. This seems quite acceptable, Mr. Nordstrom. Good. I've asked my foreman, Frank Porter, to show you the schoolhouse after breakfast. The children will be gathering there around 9 to meet you. He closed his ledger. I have business in the north pasture today, but I'll return by supper. Mrs. Whittaker entered with fresh coffee. Mr. Porter is waiting on the porch, sir. Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. Miss Harrington, I'll leave you in Frank's capable hands. Pearl followed Mrs. Whittaker to the porch, where a weathered man in his 50s waited. Frank Porter had the lean, tough look of a lifelong cowhand, but his smile was genuine when he removed his hat. Morning, madam. Welcome to Northstar. Thank you, Mr. Porter. Just Frank, madam. Everyone calls me Frank. He gestured toward a building about 100 yards from the main house. "That there's going to be your schoolhouse. Boss has had us fixing it up these past 2 weeks." As they walked, Frank gave her a brief history of the ranch. "Mr. Nordstrom came out here about 8 years ago. Bought the place when it wasn't much more than a run-down cabin and a few hundred acres of grass. Built it up steady-like. Now we run about 2,000 head of cattle and employ 15 hands full-time." "That's impressive growth," Pearl remarked. "Boss works harder than any man I've known, and he's fair, treats his men right." Frank's tone conveyed deep respect. "Ain't easy building something like this in Wyoming Territory, especially with men like Blackfield trying to gobble up everything they see." They reached the schoolhouse, and Frank held the door for her. Inside, Pearl found a room transformed with obvious care. 8 double desks faced a larger desk at the front of the room. A blackboard covered most of the front wall. Shelves along the side walls held books, not many, but more than she had expected to find on a remote ranch. "It's wonderful," she breathed. Frank looked pleased. "Boss wanted it done right, said education's as important as food and shelter for growing youngsters." He pointed to a pot-bellied stove in the corner. "That'll keep it warm come winter, and there's a woodpile out back the older boys are responsible for keeping it stocked." The sound of children's voices drifted through the open door. Frank grinned. "Sounds like your students are arriving. I'll make the introductions, then leave you to get acquainted." The children filed in a mix of ages, sizes, and backgrounds that reflected the diverse population of the territory. 5 lived on the ranch itself, the cook's 3 children and the motherless son and daughter of one of the ranch hands. The others came from surrounding homesteads, riding in on ponies or walking as far as 3 miles. Frank introduced them one by one, then took his leave. Pearl spent the rest of the morning assessing their knowledge and abilities, which varied widely. By noon, she had a preliminary plan for organizing their studies. The children returned home for the midday meal, and Pearl walked back to her cabin. She found a basket on her doorstep containing a sandwich, an apple, and a note from Mrs. Whitaker explaining that lunch would typically be provided this way, allowing her a quiet hour to herself. The afternoon passed quickly as Pearl prepared her first lessons. When the children departed at 3, she remained in the schoolhouse, making notes and organizing materials until the fading light reminded her that supper would soon be served. As she crossed the yard toward the main house, Pearl spotted Vaughn returning with several of his men. They were dusty and tired looking after a day's work with the cattle, but Vaughn straightened in his saddle when he saw her, lifting a hand in greeting. "Miss Harrington, how was your first day?" "Promising, Mr. Nordstrom. You have some bright minds among your young charges." He dismounted, handing his reins to one of the hands. "I'm glad to hear it. They've been excited about having a real teacher." He fell into step beside her. "I'll need a few minutes to clean up, but perhaps you join me for supper again. I'm eager to hear your plans for the school." Over the meal, Pearl outlined her assessment of the children's needs and her proposed curriculum. Vaughn listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed his own solid education. "Where did you study, Mr. Nordstrom?" Pearl asked finally, her curiosity getting the better of her. A shadow crossed his face. "Harvard, briefly, my father insisted." His tone discouraged further inquiry, but after a moment he added, "I left during my 2nd year. The West seemed to offer more authentic opportunities." "And did it?" "Yes and no." He refilled her water glass. "I've built something here that I'm proud of, but the territory has its own challenges. Men like Blackfield represent the worst of them, using money and intimidation to take what isn't rightfully theirs. Like what happened to my father." "Yes." He met her eyes directly. "Your father was a good man, Miss Harrington. He refused to be bullied into selling land that Blackfield wanted for a water right. When conventional pressure didn't work, Blackfield resorted to other methods." "What do you mean?" Vaughn hesitated. "Your father's loans were suddenly called in all at once, with interest rates that hadn't been in the original agreements. When he couldn't pay, Blackfield was waiting to buy the debts." Anger flared in Pearl's chest. "That's criminal." "It is. But with Judge Harmon in his pocket, Blackfield operates with impunity. Vaughn's expression hardened. Until now. What's changed? The territorial governor has finally taken notice of the pattern of complaints. There's a federal marshal investigating corruption in the judiciary. He leaned forward, which is why your situation was particularly dangerous. If you had disappeared into Blackfield's household, there would have been one less witness to his methods. Pearl absorbed this information slowly. You believe my father was deliberately ruined. I know he was. And I know because I was his partner in the water rights venture that Blackfield wanted to destroy. Vaughn's voice was tight with controlled anger. I should have been there to help him fight, but I was in Denver arranging financing. By the time I returned, it was too late. So when you said you owed him a debt, I meant I owed him justice. Vaughn's blue eyes held hers, and protection for his daughter. The intensity of his gaze made Pearl look away first. I see, do you? He sighed. Perhaps not entirely. But you should know that your presence here might eventually draw Blackfield's attention. If you wish to leave for somewhere safer, no. The word came swiftly, surprising them both. I won't be driven away by fear. These children need a teacher, and I need. She faltered. What do you need, Miss Harrington? His voice had softened. Purpose, she said finally. And perhaps a chance to see justice done for my father. A smile touched Vaughn's lips. Then we share the same goals. He rose from the table. It's getting late, and you have school tomorrow. Allow me to walk you to your cabin. The night air was cool and sweet with the scent of sage. Stars carpeted the sky above, more stars than Pearl had ever seen in town. As they walked in companionable silence, she stole glances at the man beside her, not just her employer now, but perhaps an ally in understanding her father's downfall. At her door, Vaughn paused. If there's anything you need for the school or your own comfort, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you for everything. On impulse, she extended her hand. He took it, his calloused palm warm against hers. For a moment, neither moved. Then he gently released her hand and stepped back. Good night, Miss Harrington. Good night, Mr. Nordstrom. Inside her cabin, Pearl lit the lamp and sat in the rocking chair, her mind swirling with all she had learned. There was more to Vaughn Nordstrom than she had initially assumed, more history, more complexity, and perhaps more danger than she had bargained for in accepting his offer. Yet she felt no regret. For the first time since her father's death, she had a purpose beyond mere survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had found an unexpected ally in the quiet, determined rancher who had purchased her freedom. The days fell into a rhythm as April gave way to May. Pearl's school flourished, with the children making remarkable progress under her guidance. The youngest learned their letters and numbers, while the older students tackled history, geography, and even basic algebra. The 16-year-old, a bright girl named Emily, whose father was one of the neighboring homesteaders, showed particular promise with literature. Pearl's relationship with Vaughn remained formal but increasingly comfortable. They often discussed the children's progress over supper, conversations that gradually expanded to include books they had both read, events in the wider world as reported in the weekly newspaper from Cheyenne, and occasionally memories of their respective childhoods. She learned that Vaughn had grown up in Boston, the son of a shipping magnate who had expected his only son to take over the family business. His decision to abandon Harvard and head west had caused a family rift that remained unhealed. In turn, she shared stories of her own upbringing in Ohio, where her father had been a respected teacher before ill health forced him to seek the drier air of Wyoming Territory. What neither discussed was Blackfield, or the growing tension in the region between the large cattle operations and the smaller ranchers and homesteaders. But Pearl heard whispers among the ranch hands when they thought she wasn't listening, rumors of fences cut on outlying homesteads, threatening notes left for families who refused to sell their land, and cattle mysteriously disappearing from small herds. One evening in mid-May, Pearl returned to her cabin after supper to find a book on her table, a volume of Tennyson's poetry she had mentioned admiring. A note in Vaughn's distinctive handwriting lay inside the front cover. I thought you might enjoy having your own copy, VN. The gift touched her more deeply than she cared to admit. She had noticed, over the weeks, how her initial gratitude toward Vaughn had evolved into something more complex: admiration for his integrity, respect for his intelligence, and increasingly, awareness of him as a man. His tall, lean frame and weathered features had begun to appear in her dreams, leaving her flustered when she encountered him in the morning. Such thoughts were dangerous, she knew. She was his employee, nothing more. The fact that he treated her with respect and kindness should not be mistaken for deeper interest. And yet, a knock at her door interrupted her reverie. She opened it to find Vaughn himself standing on her porch, his expression troubled. "I apologize for disturbing you, Miss Harrington, but I've received news you should hear." He glanced over his shoulder. "May I come in?" Pearl hesitated only briefly before nodding. Propriety suggested she should not entertain a man alone in her cabin, but the seriousness of his demeanor overrode such concerns. "What's happened?" she asked as he entered, hat in hand. "Frank just returned from town. Judge Harmon has been replaced supposedly for health reasons, though Frank says he looked healthy enough boarding the eastbound train." Vaughn's eyes glittered with intensity. "The new judge is Roland Pierce, who arrived from Denver yesterday. And this concerns me how." "Pierce is Blackfield's brother-in-law," the implications sank in slowly. "So any hope of legal recourse against Blackfield is effectively gone, yes." Vaughn paced the small confines of the cabin. "There's more." Frank overheard talk in the saloon about a woman who escaped Blackfield's grasp, a schoolteacher who should have been his but was stolen away. A chill ran down Pearl's spine. "He's still fixated on me, after all this time?" "Apparently so. And with his brother-in-law now presiding over the court, he may feel emboldened to act." Vaughn stopped pacing and faced her. "I'm concerned for your safety, Miss Harrington. What can he possibly do? I'm legally free, you saw to that. Legal documents only matter when the law is applied fairly." His voice was grim. Blackfield could fabricate charges, claim the bill of sale was forged, or simply resort to more direct methods. He has men on his payroll who wouldn't hesitate to abduct a woman if the price was right. Fear fluttered in Pearl's chest, but she forced it down. "What do you suggest?" "Ideally, you would leave the territory until this matter is resolved. I have connections in Denver who could arrange a teaching position." "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "I won't be driven away. These children need me, and She stopped herself before saying more. Vaughn studied her face. "And you what, Miss Harrington?" Pearl lifted her chin. "And I won't give Blackfield the satisfaction of running scared." A smile touched his lips. "You're a brave woman." He hesitated, then added, "Too brave, perhaps. But if you won't leave, we'll need to take precautions. From now on, I don't want you traveling alone, even just between your cabin and the schoolhouse or main house. One of the hands will be assigned to watch over you when I'm not available." "That seems excessive, please." The single word held such urgency that Pearl fell silent. "I've seen what Blackfield is capable of. I couldn't bear it if..." He stopped, his jaw working. Pearl took a step toward him, drawn by something in his voice. "If what, Mr. Nordstrom?" His blue eyes held hers. "If anything happened to you." The words were simple but laden with meaning. The air between them seemed to thicken. Pearl became acutely aware of his presence, the breadth of his shoulders beneath his simple shirt, the clean scent of soap that clung to him, the way his eyes darkened as they looked at her. "Vaughn," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. He drew a sharp breath. "Pearl." His voice caressed her name. "I should go. This is inappropriate." "Is it?" She surprised herself with her boldness. "I'm a free woman, Vaughn, free to make my own choices. You're also in my employ. I won't take advantage of that position. And if I were not in your employ?" The question hung between them. He took a step toward her, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "If you were not in my employ, I would tell you that these past weeks have been the brightest of my life, that your intelligence and courage humble me, that your beauty haunts my dreams." His voice had dropped to a near whisper. "I would tell you that I am falling in love with you, Pearl Harrington." Her heart thundered in her chest. "Then tell me those things, Vaughn Nordstrom, because while you may be my employer, that is not why I remain here." He reached out, his fingers gentle as they traced the line of her cheek. Why do you remain? Because I am falling in love with you too. The admission left her trembling. For a moment, neither moved. Then, with aching slowness, Vaughn bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, a question more than a demand. Pearl answered by rising on her toes, her hands coming to rest on his chest as she returned the kiss. It was tender at first, a tentative exploration, but quickly deepened into something more urgent. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as her hands slid up to his shoulders. The world narrowed to the sensation of his mouth on hers, the solid warmth of his body, the hammering of her heart. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Pearl," he murmured, "you deserve better than this, better than a man with enemies, better than a life of looking over your shoulder." She placed her palm against his cheek. "What I deserve is a man of honor and courage, a man who values education and freedom. A man who sees me as a person, not a possession." She smiled. "I believe I've found him." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I should still go, your reputation will survive," but she stepped back, recognizing the wisdom in his words. "We have much to discuss, but it can wait until tomorrow." Vaughn nodded, reluctantly moving toward the door. "I'll have Frank escort you to the schoolhouse in the morning, and Pearl—" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Be careful, Blackfield is not a man to be underestimated." After he left, Pearl sank into her rocking chair, her fingers touching her lips in wonder. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, revealing feelings she had only half acknowledged to herself. Yet beneath the glow of new love lurked a shadow: Blackfield's renewed interest in her, and the potential danger it represented. As she prepared for bed, Pearl found herself glancing repeatedly at the door, checking that the lock was secure. For the first time since arriving at Northstar Ranch, she felt the isolation of her small cabin as a vulnerability rather than a comfort. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with unsettling dreams. The following morning dawned gray and cool, with dark clouds gathering on the western horizon promising rain by afternoon. As promised, Frank Porter was waiting on her porch to escort her to the schoolhouse. If he found this new arrangement unusual, he gave no indication, chatting about the weather and the likelihood of a good grass year if the rains continued. Inside the schoolhouse, Pearl found a note propped against her desk, Vaughn's handwriting again, but this time the message was brief. "Riding to the north boundary today. Will return by supper. Stay close to the main buildings. V." She tucked the note into her pocket as the children began to arrive, pushing thoughts of both danger and romance aside to focus on her duties. The morning passed uneventfully, though the younger students were restless with the approaching storm. By noon, the first fat raindrops were falling. Pearl dismissed the children early, knowing that those who had to travel would need extra time to reach home safely. Frank appeared at the schoolhouse door as the last child departed. "Mr. Nordstrom asked me to keep an eye on you, madam," he said, his weathered face serious. "I'll walk you back to your cabin." "Thank you, Frank, but I thought I might spend some time in the main house. Mrs. Whitaker mentioned needing help with mending yesterday." Frank nodded, clearly relieved that she wouldn't be alone in her isolated cabin during the storm. As they crossed the muddy yard, the rain intensified, driven by gusting wind that threatened to tear Pearl's shawl from her shoulders. The warmth of the main house was welcome after the chill outside. Mrs. Whitaker was in the kitchen, preparing bread dough while a pot of soup simmered on the stove. She looked up as Pearl entered, a hint of surprise crossing her normally impassive features. "Miss Harrington, I didn't expect to see you until supper." "The weather cut our school day short," Pearl explained, removing her damp shawl. "I recalled you mentioning some mending that needed doing, and thought I might help while waiting out the storm." Mrs. Whitaker's expression softened slightly. "That's kind of you. There's a basket in the sitting room with some of the ranch hands' shirts that need attention." She gestured to a chair by the stove. "But warm yourself first. You're shivering." Pearl accepted a cup of hot tea and settled by the fire, listening as the rain drummed against the windows. The coziness of the kitchen, with its appetizing smells and gentle warmth, stood in stark contrast to her unease about Blackfield's renewed interest. "Mrs. Whitaker," she ventured after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "how long have you worked for Mr. Nordstrom?" "Since he first bought this place, nearly 8 years now." The older woman punched down her dough with practiced hands. "I was cook at the Double Diamond spread south of here when the owner died and his son sold out. Mr. Nordstrom hired me and my late husband on the spot. He seems to inspire great loyalty in his people." Mrs. Whitaker glanced at Pearl with shrewd eyes. "He's a good man, fair, expects hard work but compensates well for it." She began shaping the dough into loaves. "Not like some in these parts who treat their help like they're one step above the cattle." "You mean men like Jason Blackfield?" Pearl asked quietly, the housekeeper's hands stilled momentarily. "I wouldn't presume to name names, Miss Harrington," she resumed her work, "but I will say that Mr. Nordstrom has stood against those who would take by force what they couldn't acquire honestly. It hasn't made him popular in certain quarters." "I'm beginning to understand that." Pearl sipped her tea. "Mrs. Whitaker, do you know what connection Mr. Nordstrom had with my father?" "He mentioned they were business partners, but—" "That's his story to tell, not mine." Mrs. Whitaker's tone was kind but firm. "But I will say this, I've never seen him as concerned about anyone as he is about you." She slid the loaves into the oven. "Now, about that mending." The afternoon passed peacefully as Pearl worked her way through the basket of shirts, her neat stitches repairing torn seams and replacing missing buttons. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning occasionally illuminating the kitchen with brilliant flashes followed by rolling thunder. "Mr. Nordstrom will be thoroughly soaked if he's caught out in this," Pearl remarked, concern coloring her voice. Mrs. Whitaker smiled faintly. "He's weathered worse, though he'll appreciate dry clothes and hot food when he returns." She checked the soup, adding a pinch of salt. "You care for him, don't you?" Pearl felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I admire him greatly. MMM." The housekeeper's noncommittal response suggested she understood more than Pearl had said. "He deserves some happiness. This place, these people, they've been his life for too long." Before Pearl could respond, the kitchen door burst open, bringing with it a gust of rain-laden wind and Frank Porter, his hat and coat streaming water. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice tight with urgency, "riders coming, 6, maybe 7 of them." He glanced at Pearl. "They're flying Blackfield's brand." Pearl's heart lurched. "Are you certain?" Frank nodded grimly. "No mistake about it, and they're coming fast despite the weather." He turned to Mrs. Whitaker. "Where's the boss?" "Still out on the north boundary, I expect. He wasn't due back until supper." Frank cursed under his breath. "Round up whoever's in the bunkhouse. Tell them to arm themselves but stay out of sight unless I signal." He looked at Pearl. "Miss Harrington, you should hide." "Hide in my own," she stopped, remembering that this wasn't truly her home. "Where?" "The root cellar," Mrs. Whitaker said decisively. "This way." Pearl followed the housekeeper through a door off the kitchen and down a short flight of wooden steps. The root cellar was cool and earthy smelling, lined with shelves holding preserves, vegetables, and other supplies. "Stay here until Frank or I come for you," Mrs. Whitaker instructed, lighting a lantern and placing it on a barrel. "And take this." She pressed a small revolver into Pearl's hand. "Do you know how to use it?" "My father taught me," Pearl said, surprised by the weight of the weapon. "But surely it won't come to that." Mrs. Whitaker's face was grave in the lantern light. "Let us pray it doesn't, but Blackfield's men aren't known for their gentle ways." She squeezed Pearl's shoulder. "Be brave, child, Mr. Nordstrom will come." With that, she ascended the stairs, leaving Pearl alone in the dim cellar. Above, she could hear muffled voices, then the sound of boots on the porch. Heart pounding, she positioned herself behind a stack of barrels, the revolver clutched in trembling hands. Time stretched into an eternity as Pearl strained to hear what was happening above. Occasionally, raised voices penetrated the floor, but she couldn't make out words. Then, suddenly, heavy footsteps crossed the kitchen floor directly overhead. A man's voice, not Frank's, called out, "Check the back rooms." More footsteps, doors opening and closing. Pearl held her breath as someone approached the cellar door. The latch rattled, then the door swung open. Light spilled down the stairs as a figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man in a dripping coat, his face obscured by shadow. "Well, well," he drawled. "What have we here?" Pearl raised the revolver. "Stay where you are," the man chuckled. "The schoolteacher has spirit." He took a step down. "Put that toy away before you hurt yourself, Miss Harrington. Mr. Blackfield just wants to talk." "Mr. Blackfield can go to hell." The words escaped before she could stop them. The man's chuckle deepened into a laugh. "He'll enjoy taming you." Another step. "Now we can do this easy or we can do it hard. Your choice." Pearl's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said stay back." "You won't shoot," he said confidently, descending further. "A genteel lady like yourself doesn't have the stomach," for the roar of the revolver was deafening in the confined space. The man howled, clutching his leg as he stumbled against the wall. Above, shouts erupted, followed by the sound of running feet. "You shot me." The man gasped, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You'll pay for that, you little—" A second shot rang out, but not from Pearl's gun. The man's eyes widened in shock before he collapsed on the stairs. Vaughn Nordstrom stood in the doorway, his own revolver still raised, water streaming from his hat and coat. His face, usually so controlled, was a mask of cold rage. "Pearl," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Vaughn descended the stairs, stepping carefully over the fallen man. He took the revolver gently from Pearl's rigid fingers, then drew her into his arms. She went willingly, burying her face against his wet coat as tremors shook her body. "You're safe now," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you." "You're safe. The others," she managed finally. "My men were ready for them. Frank had the situation well in hand by the time I arrived." His arms tightened around her. "One of Blackfield's men is dead, 3 wounded, including this one. The others surrendered." Pearl pulled back slightly to look at his face. "And Blackfield himself, not among them. He sent his men to do his dirty work." Vaughn's jaw tightened. "But this ends now. This was an attack on my home, my people." His eyes found hers. "On the woman I love." Despite everything, the danger, the violence, the lingering fear, Pearl felt a surge of joy at his words. "Vaughn." He kissed her then, a fierce, possessive kiss that spoke of relief and fear and love intermingled. Pearl responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed herself closer. When they broke apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "We need to get you somewhere safer until this is resolved." "I'm not leaving," Pearl said firmly. "We've had this discussion." "Circumstances have changed." He gestured to the wounded man on the stairs. "This was a direct attempt to abduct you. Blackfield won't stop now, then we'll have to stop him." She met his gaze steadily. "Together." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. And yet you love me." "God help me, I do." He sighed, then seemed to come to a decision. "If you won't leave and I can see that you won't, then there's only one solution I can think of, which is, marry me." Pearl blinked, certain she had misheard. "What, marry me?" Vaughn repeated, taking her hands in his. "As my wife, you would have additional legal protections." Blackfield could still challenge the bill of sale, but attacking a marriage is another matter entirely, even with his brother-in-law on the bench. "You want to marry me, for legal protection?" Pearl couldn't keep the disappointment from her voice. Vaughn's expression softened. "No, Pearl. I want to marry you because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you in it, because you've brought light and laughter and purpose to a place that was just land and cattle before you arrived." He squeezed her hands. "The legal protection is merely a convenient side benefit." A smile spread across Pearl's face. "In that case, Vaughn Nordstrom, my answer is yes." Joy transformed his features, erasing the lines of worry that had been there moments before. He pulled her close again, his kiss tender this time, a promise of a future together. From above came the sound of Frank Porter clearing his throat. "Boss, everything all right down there?" Vaughn reluctantly released Pearl. "Everything's fine, Frank, we're coming up." He looked at the wounded man. "Have the doc see to him, then lock him in the storage shed until the marshal can collect him." Already sent for Doc Williams, Frank replied, and I've got the other prisoners secured in the barn. Good work. Vaughn took Pearl's hand. Let's get you out of this cellar. As they emerged into the kitchen, Pearl was struck by the transformation. What had been a peaceful, warm haven hours earlier was now in disarray, with muddy boot prints on the floor and signs of a struggle. Mrs. Whitaker was already sweeping up broken crockery, her expression grim. Mrs. Whitaker, Vaughn said, his voice gentle, I believe we'll need to prepare for a wedding as soon as possible. The housekeeper paused mid-sweep, her eyes darting between them. A rare smile softened her stern features. About time, she said, and resumed her sweeping. Frank's weathered face split into a grin. Well now, that's some good news in the midst of all this mess. Congratulations, boss, Miss Harrington. Thank you, Frank, Pearl said, feeling a blush heat her cheeks. Vaughn squeezed her hand. We'll need to ride to town tomorrow to get a license and find a preacher willing to perform the ceremony quickly. Reverend Thompson from the settlement at Bear Creek is staying at the Johnston place, Frank offered. He's doing a circuit of the outlying ranches. Due there through the end of the week. Perfect. Send a rider first thing in the morning. Vaughn turned to Pearl. If that suits you, it does, she said, surprising herself with her certainty. A week ago, the idea of such a hasty marriage would have seemed reckless. Now, it felt like the most natural decision in the world. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Despite the continued threat from Blackfield, or perhaps because of it, the entire ranch threw itself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm. Vaughn rode to town with several armed men to obtain the license and dispatch telegrams to the territorial capital regarding the attack. Pearl, meanwhile, found herself the center of attention as Mrs. Whitaker and the wives of several ranch hands transformed one of her teaching dresses into a suitable wedding gown. Reverend Thompson arrived 2 days after the attack, a jovial man with a booming voice who took the unusual circumstances in stride. The Lord works in mysterious ways, he told Pearl when she explained the situation. Sometimes love blooms most vigorously in rocky soil. The wedding was set for Saturday afternoon, as Pearl prepared in her cabin, helped by Mrs. Whitaker and Emily, the 16-year-old student who had been thrilled to be asked to serve as maid of honor. She felt a curious mixture of calm certainty and giddy anticipation. You make a beautiful bride, Emily sighed as she helped arrange Pearl's hair, which Mrs. Whitaker had insisted should be worn down, adorned only with a crown of wildflowers gathered that morning. Indeed she does, Mrs. Whitaker agreed, smoothing a wrinkle from the dress, a simple gown of pale blue cotton that had been embellished with lace from the housekeeper's own wedding dress. Mr. Nordstrom won't be able to take his eyes off you. A knock at the door announced Frank Porter, who had been assigned to escort Pearl to the ceremony. His normally impassive face broke into a smile when he saw her. Miss Harrington, he said, doffing his hat, you're a vision. Pearl took his offered arm, her heart fluttering. Thank you, Frank. Is everything ready? All set. The men have been scrubbed and polished within an inch of their lives, and the boss, Frank chuckled. Well, let's just say I've never seen him so nervous, not even when facing down a stampede. The ceremony was to be held in the main house's sitting room, which had been transformed with wildflowers and ribbon. As Pearl entered on Frank's arm, her eyes immediately found Vaughn, standing before the fireplace with Reverend Thompson. He wore a black suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and his dark hair was neatly combed. But it was the expression on his face as he saw her that Pearl would remember for the rest of her life, a mixture of awe, joy, and love so intense it nearly took her breath away. The vows were simple and heartfelt. Pearl spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the emotions swelling within her. Vaughn's deeper tones resonated with conviction as he promised to love, honor, and protect her all the days of his life. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn drew Pearl into a kiss that prompted cheers and whistles from the assembled ranch hands. She laughed against his lips, feeling lighter than she had in months, perhaps years. The celebration that followed was joyous but brief, a practical necessity given the ongoing tension with Blackfield. As dusk fell, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds alone in the main house for the first time. Mrs. Nordstrom, Vaughn said, drawing Pearl into his arms once the door closed behind the last guest. "How do you like the sound of that?" "I find I like it very much indeed, Mr. Nordstrom." She smiled up at him, still hardly able to believe that this man, this strong, honorable, intelligent man, was now her husband. He kissed her, a lingering kiss that held the promise of the night to come. "I never thought to find happiness like this," he murmured against her lips. "Not after everything that's happened, nor did I." Pearl rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. "It seems we were both due for some good fortune." Vaughn led her to the stairs, pausing at the bottom to sweep her into his arms. Pearl laughed in surprise as he carried her up to the master bedroom, a room she had never seen before. "Welcome home," he said simply, as he set her on her feet. The room was larger than she had expected, dominated by a massive bed with a handsome quilt. A fire burned in the small fireplace, casting a warm glow over the polished wood furniture. On the nightstand sat a vase of wildflowers matching those in her hair. "It's lovely," she said, touched by the thoughtful preparations. "It was lonely before." Vaughn stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Like everything else in my life until you arrived," Pearl turned to face him, her hands rising to frame his face. "No more loneliness for either of us." Their kiss deepened, hands beginning to explore as the day's formalities gave way to the intimacy of husband and wife. With gentle care, Vaughn helped Pearl out of her wedding dress, his breath catching at the sight of her in her simple cotton chemise. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Pearl's fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt, her own breathing unsteady as she revealed the muscled chest beneath. "As are you, husband." The night unfolded in a tender exploration of each other, their bodies joining in the ancient dance of love. For Pearl, who had feared she might one day be forced into unwanted intimacy, the experience was a revelation. Vaughn's touch was gentle yet passionate, his concern for her pleasure evident in every caress. Afterward, as they lay entwined beneath the quilt, Pearl traced lazy patterns on Vaughn's chest. "I never imagined my life would take such a turn," she mused. From the auction block to a bride in just a few months, Vaughn's arm tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was there to outbid Blackfield." "As do I." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "But we still have to deal with him, don't we? The marriage protects me legally, but he won't stop coming after us after you because of it." Vaughn sighed, his expression sobering. "No, he won't. Not until he's forced to." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "The telegrams I sent might help. The territorial governor has promised to send a federal marshal to investigate the attack and other complaints against Blackfield. But that will take time, and until then, we remain vigilant. No one rides alone, especially not you." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "But let's not talk of Blackfield tonight. Tonight is for us." Pearl was content to let the subject drop, losing herself again in the wonder of being Vaughn Nordstrom's wife. The weeks following their wedding were a blend of marital bliss and constant vigilance. Pearl continued teaching, though now she did so as Mrs. Nordstrom, a change that delighted her students. She moved her belongings to the main house, converting her former cabin into a library for the ranch, a wedding gift from Vaughn that brought tears to her eyes when he suggested it. Their nights were spent discovering each other, building a physical and emotional intimacy that deepened with each passing day. Pearl found in Vaughn not just a protector and lover, but a true partner who valued her mind as much as her body, who sought her opinion on ranch matters and deferred to her expertise regarding the school. Yet beneath this domestic happiness ran an undercurrent of tension. Blackfield had gone ominously quiet since the failed abduction attempt. His wounded men had been collected by the local law, not Marshal Jenkins, who had mysteriously disappeared, but his deputy, a young man who seemed genuinely shocked by the attack on Northstar Ranch. "It's the calm before the storm," Frank warned one evening as he reported on his latest trip to town. Word is Blackfield's hiring guns professional troublemakers from as far away as Kansas City. Vaughn nodded grimly. I expected as much. How many men do we have who can shoot straight in a pinch? 10, maybe 12 I'd trust with my life. Frank glanced at Pearl, who sat at the dining table with her schoolbooks. Begging your pardon, madam, for such talk at supper. There's no need to shield me, Frank, Pearl said. I prefer knowing what we're facing. Vaughn reached across the table to squeeze her hand. We'll be ready for whatever comes. But neither of them was prepared for the form Blackfield's next move would take. It began with a letter delivered by a nervous boy from town, a formal notice from Judge Pierce, requiring Pearl's presence in court to address irregularities in her bill of sale and subsequent marriage. The document alleged that Pearl had been Blackfield's legal property at the time of her marriage, rendering the union invalid. This is absurd, Vaughn fumed, pacing the sitting room after reading the notice. He can't possibly make such a claim stand up, even with his brother-in-law on the bench. Can't he? Pearl's voice was steady, but fear churned in her stomach. If the judge is corrupt, then we don't appear in his court. Vaughn's decision was swift. This is a trap, nothing more. If you step foot in that courthouse, Blackfield will have men waiting to take you, court order in hand. If I don't appear, they could declare me in contempt or worse, rule in Blackfield's favor by default. Pearl stood, moving to the window that overlooked the ranch yard. We need to fight this legally, Vaughn, otherwise we're playing into his hands. Vaughn joined her at the window, his reflection in the glass showing the conflict in his eyes. I won't risk you, and I won't live in fear forever. She turned to face him. We need help, legal help that Blackfield can't intimidate or bribe. A thoughtful expression crossed Vaughn's face. There might be a way. He walked to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper. I have a contact in Cheyenne, a lawyer who once worked for my father's company. I saved his son from drowning during a cattle drive 3 years ago. If anyone can help us navigate this legally, it's Patrick Sullivan. Then write to him, Pearl urged. Immediately. Vaughn did better than write. He sent Frank to Cheyenne on the next train with a personal appeal for Sullivan to come to their aid. The wait for his return was excruciating, made worse by reports that Blackfield's men were watching the roads to town, presumably to intercept Pearl if she attempted to answer the court summons. 5 days later, Frank returned with Patrick Sullivan, a small, wiry man with spectacles and the most meticulously groomed mustache Pearl had ever seen. Despite his diminutive stature and scholarly appearance, Sullivan radiated confidence. Mrs. Nordstrom, he said, taking Pearl's hand. A pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Thank you for coming, Mr. Sullivan. Patrick, please. He smiled, revealing dimples that made him appear boyish despite his 40-odd years. Vaughn saved my Jonathan's life. I'd walk through fire for him if asked. After refreshments were served, Sullivan got down to business, reviewing the court summons and the bill of sale that had granted Pearl her freedom. This document is unassailable, he declared finally. You were legally freed before your marriage, which is therefore valid and binding. He removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. However, with Judge Pierce presiding, well, let's just say the law as written and the law as applied may diverge significantly. So what do we do? Vaughn asked, his arm around Pearl's shoulders. We go over Pierce's head. Sullivan replaced his spectacles. I've already taken the liberty of filing a petition with the Territorial Supreme Court, requesting their intervention on grounds of judicial bias. Given Pierce's family connection to Blackfield, we have a strong case. Hope flickered in Pearl's chest. How long will that take? Ordinarily, weeks or even months. Sullivan held up a hand as both Pearl and Vaughn began to protest. But I have friends in the governor's office. Given the urgency and the unusual nature of the case, they've agreed to expedite our petition. We should have a response within days. And until then, Vaughn's voice was tight with concern. Until then, Mrs. Nordstrom should absolutely not appear in Pierce's court as summoned. That would place her under his jurisdiction before our petition can be heard. Sullivan's expression grew serious. But be prepared for escalation. Men like Blackfield don't respond well to legal maneuvers. The lawyer's warning proved prophetic. 2 days after Sullivan's arrival, one of the outlying pastures was set ablaze, destroying valuable grazing land and nearly killing 2 hands who were moving cattle in the area. The following night, shots were fired at the main house, warning shots that broke windows but injured no one. Vaughn's patience, never his most abundant quality, was wearing dangerously thin. "I should ride out and end this," he declared after the shooting incident, checking his revolver. "And get yourself killed." Pearl stood in their bedroom doorway, watching as he strapped on his gun belt. "That's exactly what he wants. What would you have me do? Wait until he burns us out or picks off my men one by one?" Vaughn's voice was harsh with frustration. "I would have you trust in the law a little longer." Sullivan appeared behind Pearl, his expression grave. "I received word today. The Territorial Supreme Court has agreed to hear our petition tomorrow morning in Cheyenne." Both Pearl and Vaughn stared at him. "Tomorrow," Pearl echoed. Sullivan nodded. "We must leave immediately to arrive in time. The night train departs in 3 hours. Vaughn's brow furrowed. "Pearl isn't going anywhere near Cheyenne. It's too dangerous." "On the contrary," Sullivan countered, "Mrs. Nordstrom must appear before the court. Her testimony regarding the auction, the bill of sale, and the subsequent harassment is essential to our case." "Absolutely not." Vaughn's tone brooked no argument. "Blackfield will have men watching every road, every train, which is why we won't be taking the obvious route." Sullivan smiled thinly. "Frank has arranged for a wagon to meet us 2 miles south of here. We'll travel cross-country to the Jenkins place, where Mrs. Jenkins, who, I might add, bears a striking resentment toward her husband's former employer, has agreed to shelter us until a private coach can take us to a small station 10 miles east of town. From there, we can board the train without being observed." Pearl laid a hand on Vaughn's arm. "It's our best chance, Vaughn, perhaps our only chance." He covered her hand with his own, his expression torn. "I can't lose you, Pearl, not to Blackfield, not to anyone." "You won't," she promised, "but we need to end this once and for all." In the end, Vaughn agreed, though his reluctance was evident in every preparation for their journey. He insisted on accompanying them, leaving Frank in charge of the ranch with strict instructions to keep the men alert for any sign of trouble. The journey to Cheyenne was tense but uneventful, Sullivan's circuitous route apparently succeeding in evading Blackfield's watchers. They arrived at the Territorial Capitol building just as dawn was breaking, tired and travel-worn but determined. The hearing before the 3-judge panel was brief but thorough. Sullivan presented their case with eloquent precision, while Pearl spoke with quiet dignity about her experiences from the auction block to the attempted abduction. Vaughn's testimony regarding Blackfield's pattern of intimidation and violence added weight to their petition. By mid-morning, the court had reached its decision. Judge Pierce was ordered to recuse himself from all matters involving Pearl or Vaughn Nordstrom, and a special judge would be appointed to review any claims Blackfield might make regarding the bill of sale. "It's a victory," Sullivan told them as they left the courthouse, "but not a complete one. Blackfield can still pursue his claims, just not in his brother-in-law's court." "It's enough," Pearl said, feeling as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "With a fair judge, the truth will prevail." Vaughn's arm tightened around her waist. "Let's go home, Mrs. Nordstrom." They took the regular train back to town, no longer concerned about being seen now that they had the territorial court's protection. The journey was peaceful, Pearl dozing against Vaughn's shoulder as the landscape rolled by, Sullivan engrossed in legal documents across from them. It was nearly dusk when they arrived at the small station serving their corner of the territory. Frank was waiting with the wagon, his weathered face splitting into a grin when he saw them. "Good news, I take it," he called as they approached. "The best," Vaughn replied, helping Pearl down from the train. "How are things at the ranch?" Frank's grin faded slightly. "Quiet, too quiet, if you ask me. Not a peep from Blackfield or his men since you left." Vaughn and Pearl exchanged glances. "That doesn't sound like Blackfield," Vaughn said slowly. "No, it doesn't," Sullivan agreed, joining them. "We should proceed with caution." The ride to Northstar Ranch was tense, all of them watching for signs of ambush. But they arrived safely, the ranch buildings emerging from the twilight as they crested the final hill. Something was wrong. Even from a distance, Pearl could see that the usual lamps weren't lit in the main house windows. And where were the hands who should have been finishing evening chores? Vaughn, she began, but he had already noticed. Frank stopped the wagon. Vaughn's voice was low and controlled, but Pearl could feel the tension radiating from him. Something's not right. They halted on the hill, hidden by a stand of pine trees as they surveyed the ranch below. No movement was visible in the yard or near the buildings. Could be a trap, Frank murmured, his hand moving to the rifle beside him. Or they could be in trouble, Pearl countered. Thinking of Mrs. Whitaker and the children who lived on the ranch, Vaughn made a quick decision. Frank, take Pearl and Sullivan around to the back way through the creek bed. It's harder to watch. I'll approach from the front, draw attention if there's anyone waiting. No, Pearl protested. We stay together. Pearl, please. Vaughn's eyes held hers. I can't focus on whatever's happening down there if I'm worried about you being in the line of fire. Before she could argue further, a figure emerged from the shadows of the barn, Mrs. Whitaker, moving quickly toward the bunkhouse. Even from a distance, her urgency was apparent. Something's definitely wrong, Frank said. Mrs. Whitaker wouldn't leave the house this late unless there was trouble. Vaughn's jaw set in a hard line. Change of plan. We all go in together, but carefully. Frank, bring the wagon up to that fallen oak. We'll proceed on foot from there. They moved cautiously down the hill, using the deepening shadows for cover. At the oak, they left the wagon and continued on foot, staying low as they approached the ranch buildings. The silence was eerie, no sounds of men talking, no clink of tools being put away, not even a dog barking. The bunkhouse first, Vaughn whispered as they neared the yard. Mrs. Whitaker went there for a reason. They slipped from shadow to shadow until they reached the long, low building where the ranch hands slept. Vaughn motioned for Pearl and Sullivan to stay back as he and Frank approached the door, weapons ready. Mrs. Whitaker, Vaughn called softly. It's Vaughn. We're back. The door cracked open and Mrs. Whitaker's face appeared, tight with worry. Thank God, she breathed. They've got the men locked in the barn. Blackfield and his new gun hands. They arrived just after noon. How many? Frank asked. 8, maybe 10. They were waiting in the house when I returned from gathering eggs. They had the children all ready. Her voice broke. Pearl stepped forward. The children, are they hurt? No, not hurt, scared. They're in the main house with 2 guards. Mrs. Whitaker straightened her shoulders. Blackfield said he's waiting for you to return, said he has a proposition. Vaughn's expression hardened. I'll bet he does. He turned to Pearl. Stay here with Sullivan and Mrs. Whitaker. Frank and I will boss. The urgent whisper came from inside the bunkhouse. One of the younger hands, Tommy, appeared beside Mrs. Whitaker. There's movement at the house. Looks like they spotted the wagon, Vaughn cursed under his breath. We're out of time for stealth. He looked at Pearl, his eyes intense. Whatever happens, stay out of sight, promise me. She wanted to argue but knew this wasn't the time. I promise. He kissed her quickly, fiercely, then turned to Frank. Let's go. Before they could take 2 steps, lanterns flared to life across the yard, illuminating the space between buildings. A voice called out, That's far enough, Nordstrom. Jason Blackfield stood on the porch of the main house, a rifle in his hands. Behind him, more men emerged from the shadows, all armed. Blackfield, Vaughn shouted back, stepping into the light. What kind of coward threatens women and children? The kind who gets what he wants. Blackfield's voice was cold. I've come for what's mine, the woman and the water rights your partner cheated me out of. Pearl is my wife, not your property. And Harrington never cheated you. You tried to steal his land and failed. Vaughn's hand hovered near his holstered revolver. Now let my people go and we can discuss this like civilized men. Blackfield laughed, the sound echoing in the night air. Civilized? There's nothing civilized about the way you stole that woman from the auction block. I had bid fair and square. There was nothing fair about that auction, and you know it. Vaughn took another step forward. The Territorial Supreme Court has ruled, Blackfield. Your brother-in-law can't help you anymore. A flash of anger crossed Blackfield's face. Courts can be overruled, judges can be replaced. But possession, that's 9/10 of the law, isn't it? He gestured. And 2 of his men emerged from the house. each holding one of the cook's children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 10. Pearl's heart clenched at the sight of her students held roughly by Blackfield's thugs. "Now," Blackfield continued, "here's my proposition. You sign over the water rights your partner left you, and I'll leave the children unharmed. You also tell me where the woman is hiding, and I'll let your men go." "And if I refuse," Blackfield shrugged, "then things get unpleasant." Starting with these little ones. Pearl couldn't bear it any longer. Despite her promise to Vaughn, she stepped out from the shadows. "I'm here, Blackfield. Let the children go." "Pearl, no." Vaughn's voice was anguished. Blackfield's face split into a triumphant smile. "Well, well, Mrs. Nordstrom herself, how convenient." "Let the children go," Pearl repeated, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your quarrel is with me and my husband, not with innocence. My quarrel is with anyone who stands between me and what I want." Blackfield nodded to his men, who released the children but kept their weapons trained on them. "And what I want, Mrs. Nordstrom, is for your husband to understand what it feels like to have something valuable taken from him." "That's enough, Blackfield." A new voice rang out from the darkness beyond the yard. All heads turned as a group of riders emerged into the light, at least a dozen men, all wearing badges that glinted in the lamplight. At their head rode a tall man with a marshal's star. "Federal Marshal James Cooper," the man announced. "Jason Blackfield, you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping, assault, extortion, and a list of other charges too long to enumerate here." Blackfield's face contorted with rage. "This is private property, Marshal. You have no jurisdiction here." "I have jurisdiction wherever federal laws are broken, Blackfield." Cooper dismounted, his movements deliberate. "And I have sworn statements from 6 different landowners in this area detailing your methods of intimidation and theft. Not to mention a very interesting confession from former Marshal Jenkins, who's eager to reduce his own sentence by telling us exactly how you manipulated the local justice system." Pearl felt a surge of hope as Cooper's men spread out, surrounding Blackfield's hired guns. Vaughn moved to her side, one arm pulling her close while his other hand remained on his weapon. "It's over, Blackfield," Cooper continued. "Tell your men to drop their weapons." For a moment, it seemed Blackfield might resist. His eyes darted wildly, calculating odds that were clearly against him. Then, with a snarl of defeat, he lowered his rifle. "Do as he says," he ordered his men. One by one, the guns clattered to the ground. Cooper's deputies moved in swiftly, securing the prisoners. "Are you all right?" Vaughn asked Pearl, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm fine." She glanced toward the main house where the cook was now rushing to embrace her children. "But I shouldn't have broken my promise." "No, you shouldn't have." His voice was stern, but his eyes held only relief. "But I understand why you did. Just don't make a habit of it, Mrs. Nordstrom." Marshal Cooper approached them, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. and Mrs. Nordstrom, sorry we cut it so close. We've been tracking Blackfield for weeks, gathering evidence. When Mr. Sullivan's telegram arrived informing us of your court victory and your return home, we knew Blackfield would make his move." "You used us as bait," Vaughn said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. Cooper had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Not intentionally. We were coming anyway. Sullivan's telegram just accelerated our timeline. If we'd known Blackfield was already here." Pearl laid a hand on Vaughn's arm. "What matters is that it's over. No one was seriously hurt." "Is it truly over, Marshal?" Vaughn asked. "Will Blackfield face justice this time?" "He will. The territorial governor himself is overseeing this case. Too many complaints have piled up to ignore." Cooper glanced toward where his men were leading the prisoners to waiting wagons. "Blackfield's reign of terror in this corner of Wyoming is finished." As the marshal returned to his duties, Vaughn pulled Pearl closer. "I thought I'd lost you when you stepped into the light," he murmured against her hair. "Never," she promised. "It would take more than Jason Blackfield to separate us." The next hours were busy with freeing the ranch hands from the barn, treating minor injuries, and giving statements to Marshal Cooper and his deputies. By the time the federal lawmen departed with their prisoners, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. Exhausted but triumphant, Pearl and Vaughn finally retired to their bedroom as the ranch began to return to its normal rhythms. Through their window, they could hear Frank giving instructions to the hands, Mrs. Whitaker directing cleanup in the kitchen, and the reassuring sounds of livestock being tended. "It hardly seems real," Pearl said as she sat on the edge of their bed, removing her shoes. "After months of fear and tension, to have it end so, definitively." Vaughn knelt before her, taking over the task of removing her shoes and massaging her tired feet. "Blackfield made a fundamental error," he said, his touch gentle despite his weariness. "What's that? He underestimated you." Vaughn looked up, his blue eyes intense. "He saw you as property to be acquired, not as the formidable woman you are," Pearl smiled, touching his cheek. "He underestimated both of us, I think, and the strength we found together." He turned his head to kiss her palm. "I thank God every day for sending you to me, Pearl. Even if the path that brought you here was painful. As do I." She leaned down to kiss him properly, her heart full of love for this man who had bid for her freedom and ended up giving her so much more: a home, a purpose, and a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible. They slept late into the morning, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that the threat hanging over them had finally been lifted. When they woke, the ranch was quiet, most of the hands having been given the day off to recover from the ordeal. Over a late breakfast, Sullivan shared news from town. Blackfield and his men had been transported to Cheyenne for trial. Judge Pierce had resigned his position amid rumors of corruption, and the territorial governor had personally commended Vaughn and Pearl for their courage in standing against intimidation. "What will you do now, Patrick?" Vaughn asked as they lingered over coffee. "Return to your practice in Cheyenne?" Sullivan nodded. "Though I may be making more frequent trips to this part of the territory. The governor has asked me to serve as a special prosecutor for cases involving land disputes and water rights." He smiled. "It seems your stand against Blackfield has inspired others to come forward with similar complaints." "That's wonderful news," Pearl said. "Too many people have suffered in silence." As Sullivan departed that afternoon, promising to return for a proper visit once the dust had settled, Vaughn suggested a ride to show Pearl something he'd been waiting to share. Curious, she agreed, and they set out on horseback toward the northern boundary of the ranch. The day was perfect, clear blue skies, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, and the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. Pearl, who had become a competent rider under Vaughn's tutelage, enjoyed the freedom of galloping across the open grassland beside her husband. After about an hour's ride, they crested a hill to find a small valley nestled below, a clear stream running through its center. Near the stream stood the frame of a house, just the skeletal beginnings, but unmistakably the start of a substantial home. "Vaughn," Pearl turned to him, questions in her eyes. He smiled, a touch of uncertainty in his expression. "I started it before we were married, before I even dared hope you might care for me. It seemed presumptuous then." He gestured toward the construction. "It's for us if you want it, a place of our own, separate from the main ranch house." Pearl dismounted, walking toward the partially built structure. She could see it now, a veranda wrapping around the front, large windows to capture the mountain view, rooms that would be filled with light and air. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But why here, so far from the main buildings?" Vaughn joined her, his hand finding hers. "Because this land was your father's." Pearl turned to him in surprise. "What?" "The water rights dispute that Blackfield wanted to win. It was over this stream and the surrounding valley. Your father owned this parcel separately from his holdings in town. When he died, the ownership transferred to me as his business partner, but—" Vaughn squeezed her hand. "It was always meant for you. He told me once that he dreamed of building a home here for you someday when the territory was more settled." Tears welled in Pearl's eyes. "I had no idea." "He was a good man who wanted only the best for his daughter." Vaughn's voice was gentle. I hoped you might want to fulfill his dream, make this place our home." "Yes," Pearl said without hesitation, throwing her arms around his neck. "Oh, Vaughn, yes." He held her close, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "We'll build it together then, our home." As they stood there in the valley that had once been her father's, surrounded by the promise of their future home, Pearl felt a sense of completion. From the auction block to this moment, a journey that had begun in despair had led her to profound joy. "I love you, Vaughn Nordstrom," she whispered against his chest, "more than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Pearl Nordstrom," he tilted her face up to his, "until the end of my days." Their kiss sealed the promise not just of love, but of a future built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the freedom they had both fought so hard to protect. 1 year later, Pearl stood on the veranda of their completed home, watching as Vaughn rode in from the north pasture. The house had turned out even more beautiful than she had imagined, spacious but cozy, with a library that housed her growing collection of books. A music room with the piano Vaughn had surprised her with on their first anniversary, and upstairs, a nursery awaiting its first occupant. She placed a hand on her slightly rounded belly, smiling as she felt the first fluttering movements of their child. The school on the main ranch property continued to flourish, with Emily now serving as Pearl's assistant teacher while she prepared for the changes motherhood would bring. Blackfield's trial had ended with a lengthy prison sentence, his empire dismantled and distributed among those he had wronged. Judge Pierce had fled the territory in disgrace. The federal investigation sparked by their case had led to sweeping reforms in the territorial justice system, changes that Patrick Sullivan, now serving on the governor's advisory council, assured them would prevent similar abuses in the future. As Vaughn dismounted and strode toward the house, his face lighting up at the sight of her, Pearl reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Had it not been for the auction block, had Vaughn not been determined to bid until she belonged to no one but herself, they might never have found each other. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Vaughn asked as he climbed the steps to join her on the veranda. Pearl smiled, taking his hand and placing it over their growing child. "I was thinking that sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest light." He drew her into his arms, his kiss a tender affirmation of all they had built together. "And sometimes," he murmured against her lips, "freedom is found in the most unexpected places." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across their land, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just freedom, but a love worth every step of the journey that had brought her home.